Hi there. Today I've brought you to the wonderful village of Fenwick in Ayrshire. Despite being a very small village, Fenwick is packed full of history. And I've picked out 3 stories connected to the village to tell you in this video. Now, Fenwick sits a few miles to the north-east of the town of Kilmarnock. And for the first story, I'm going to have to take you to a period in Scotland's history which is often referred to as the Killing Times. And it involves a group of men, women and children called Covenanters. The Covenanting times really started when the Union of the Crowns took place in 1603, when King James VI of Scotland inherited the throne of England and became King James I of England also, after the English Queen Elizabeth I died childless. Now, King James VI did not meddle too much in Scotland's religion, but his son Charles I did. He wanted to anglicise the Protestant religion of Scotland, bring it more in line with that of England. In England, bishops were in charge, and they would appoint ministers to their positions, while in Scotland this was done by the congregation, the church elders. They would appoint the ministers to their churches. To the Protestants of Scotland, this change in the religion was an attack on their nationhood. So they rebelled. They signed an oath against this called a covenant, and they became known as Covenanters. To the Stuart kings, Charles II and James VII of Scotland and II of England, this was an act of treason, and these kings sent dragoons to hunt down these Covenanters, who instead of attending churches would hold their religious services outside in secret, in moorland, on the side of hills or woods. If caught returning or going to one of these services by the government cavalry, you would have to take an oath to the king and agree to go to the appointed church that became known as the Episcopalian churches. And the Episcopalian church in Scotland is still referred to as the English church to this very day. And if you did not take this oath, you could be shot in cold blood where you stood, executed or transported overseas. This period of our history really does live up to its name, the Killing Times. And this period of religious upheaval, civil war, still divides Scotland to this very day. Fenwick sits in the Covenanting heartlands. Ayrshire, Dumfriesshire, Galloway are full of stories of atrocities committed by government troops against Covenanters. Here we are in Fenwick churchyard. This church dates back to 1643. I would love to come back and take you inside this church at some stage, because I've been invited by Fenwick Church to tell some stories before, and I got a tour of the inside of the building, and it's jam-packed with historical importance. There's battle flags from the Covenanting times, a Bible of a minister who was executed for his beliefs. It's a fantastic place. But today we're going to focus on a grave outside in the churchyard. This is the resting place of a Covenanter called James White. And this story starts one dark night in April 1685. A group of Covenanters headed to a small farm called Little Blackwood, and you can see the farm of Blackwood through the trees. It sits a few miles south-east of Fenwick. The 11 religious men held their service in one of the farm buildings. What the men did not know was a party of government dragoons, mounted soldiers, commanded by Peter Ingalls, was closing in on the farm. In the darkness, these government soldiers were surrounding the farm buildings. But something startled the Covenanters. Perhaps a farm dog started barking in the dark, or they heard a noise. Whatever, it spooked the Covenanters, and they hurriedly made plans to escape As James White tried to flee the farmyard, he might have heard a noise or spotted the outline of a dark figure. He was the only one armed, and he fired his gun, but the gun did not go off properly. The powder flashed in the pan, lighting up the area around James as he pulled the trigger. The soldiers, seeing this light as the powder flashed in the pan, returned fire, and James White fell to the ground, dead. The soldiers captured 11 Covenanters. One of them had been badly wounded after being stabbed by a bayonet, and of course James White lay dead in the farmyard. Peter Ingalls, the commander of the soldiers, found an axe in one of the farm buildings. He walked towards the lifeless corpse and hacked the head off. He then tied it to his saddlebag, and all the troops made their way to their base at the castle in Newmilns. On the journey, Ingalls decided that this wounded man who'd been stabbed was slowing them down. He ordered him to be shot, and his lifeless body was left dumped at the side of the road. As dawn broke, news of this event spread through the area. People were shocked and horrified when they were told the story about Ingalls cutting off James White's head. A big crowd of shocked and sickened locals crowded round the keep of the castle at Newmilns. Peter Ingalls came out of the keep, carrying James White's head by the hair. He tossed it high up into the air. When it hit the ground with a sickening thud, the soldiers started to kick the head around, passing it between each other in a sickening game of football. The next morning, Peter Ingalls' father, John, who was a captain of the garrison at Newmilns, brought the prisoners out. It became clear that the troops intended to execute these prisoners there and then. A few of the local officials pointed out that the present government may agree to the execution of these unarmed civilians, but if the government ever changed, then John Ingalls may be held to account for the killing of these men. Captain Ingalls sent his son Peter to Edinburgh to get permission to execute the prisoners from the Privy Council. As Peter made his way to Scotland's capital, secret meetings were being held in the town of Newmilns. Hushed conversations were being held around fireplaces and hearths in isolated buildings. A plan was being developed. Peter returned from Edinburgh with a letter from the Privy Council granting the troops permission to execute these Covenanters. The night before these executions were to take place, a group of men from Newmilns made their way to the castle. They'd brought with them a couple of big hammers that they'd borrowed from the local blacksmiths, and used these hammers to smash their way into the castle keep. In the darkness, one of these soldiers fired a shot, and one of the rescue party, a man called John Law, fell down dead. He was later buried in the courtyard of Newmilns Castle, and a plaque can be seen to John Law in the church of Newmilns to this day. The Covenanters were freed and all fled into the darkness. A massive search was held, but these men escaped. However, one homeowner who helped the prisoners when they turned up at his home and asked for food was later wounded by soldiers. He was taken to Mauchline Castle and he died of his wounds. So the killing didn't end when these men escaped custody at Newmilns Castle. So here is the grave of James White. The details of his killing and the fact that these government troops used his head as a football is written, carved in the stone, but it's quite hard to make out. And locally in this graveyard there's plenty other Covenanting tombstones, and it's a place well worth a visit. An interesting feature by the door of Fenwick Church is this set of jugs or jugs. These were used to punish, and the method of punishment would be humiliation. In Scotland, there were 3 forms of punishment. There was humiliation, mutilation, and execution. You'd have the jugs placed around your neck, you'd be fastened to the door of the church, and people would come and mock you, laugh at you. You'd often be wearing something like a horsehair shirt, which would be very, very uncomfortable. And this would be for minor crimes, like non-attendance of church on a Sunday, or blasphemy. Often for non-religious crimes, you'd be fastened to the market cross, wearing the jugs. And from the top of my head, I can name 3 churches in Scotland, apart from Fenwick, that have got jugs at the door or nearby. Monee, near Crieff, Abernethy Church, outside Perth, and Spot, which is just near Dunbar. But if you know of any other churches that have got a set of jugs by the door, then if you could tell me in the comments, I'd be very, very grateful. Now, our next story also comes from the village of Fenwick, and it involves something known as the Parliament Wall. In the late 1750s and early 1760s, workers were beginning to realise that they needed more representation in the workplace. They needed to stick together to agree a minimum price. In many of these villages in Scotland, weaving was the main source of income. You would have a hand loom in your house or cottage, and the cloth you produced, you'd then sell it to buyers. In 1758, the handloom weavers in Fenwick used to meet around the pump to discuss all manner of current affairs. But the price of their cloth was becoming more and more of a topic of conversation. Many of these ideas and discussions would be thought of as radical by the local landowner, the people who bought the cloth. All the upper class stick together, something they've always done, even to this day. They would stand around the water pump discussing their plans to set a minimum price for their cloth to regulate their industry. It was quite dangerous. So while the men stood in the shadow of the wall discussing politics, they would post their wives and children as lookouts. This was an ideal spot, as it's where 3 roads converge, so you could easily keep watch on 3 sides while these men were engaged in conversation. It was during these discussions that 9 master weavers and 7 apprentices came up with a plan to regulate the price they paid for the yarn and the price they would sell it for. To ensure this plan was legal, they set up a charter which was signed on the 14th of March 1761 in Fenwick Church, and this became the very first cooperative society in the world. The third and final story has loose connections to Fenwick, but the village does appear in the story.
Explore Provan Hall after dark.
Is it really haunted?
Join us to find out.
If you dare.
James Henry, a weaver from the village of Monkton, which sits just beside Prestwick in Ayrshire, walked into James Ballantyne's shop to buy candles and change a banknote. The Kilmarnock Fair was being held that day, the 27th of October 1814. James noticed 4 men sitting drinking whisky. The men then got up and walked out onto the street. Ballantyne's wife did not like these men. She was uneasy in their presence. In fact, she was scared of them. As they watched the men walk away, Henry stated that he would not be surprised if someone leaving the fair at Kilmarnock was robbed, indicating that if a theft was committed, it would most likely be these men. Later that day, George Lisle came into Monkton and gave the alarm that 3 people returning from the fair had been robbed. One of the men, David Dickey, an apprentice upholsterer, left the fair at Kilmarnock and was travelling towards Ayr, where at the Rosemount plantation he was approached by 4 men travelling towards Kilmarnock. As they drew nearer, one of the men struck Dickey with a stick and demanded money. David was dragged from his horse and forced into a ditch, where he was beaten up and searched. By this time, one of the men had produced a pistol and threatened to shoot Dickey. The 4 men then let David go when they heard someone approaching along the road. David Dickey made his way to Rosemount Smithy. James Ferguson, a farmer from Newlands Farm near Prestwick, and Alexander Patterson were about 6 miles from Ayr, nearing Rosemount, when they were attacked. Ferguson was dragged from his horse and beaten about the head with sticks. He was also threatened with a gun and robbed. One man grabbed Patterson's horse stirrup and threw him from the saddle. Patterson was robbed, the thieves taking money, a pocketbook, and a silver watch. The robbers tried to ambush a Robert Guthrie later that night, but Guthrie got away. At about 10 p.m, 4 men with Irish accents sat and drank whisky in an inn in Fenwick, owned by David Taylor. They paid for the drink with a Bank of Scotland 20-shilling note. Taylor's wife, Jean, knew one of the men as a John Worthington. These men paid for a room for the night. As Jean passed at the foot of the stairs, she heard one of the men counting money loudly. Jean took off her shoes and crept up the steps. She then peered through a missing bit of plaster in the wall. She could make out, in the next room, 2 men sitting at a table with their backs to her, and John Worthington sitting facing her counting money. On the table was a large pile of notes and some silver coins. The 2 men were arguing about how much money they had been given by Worthington. Later that night, the 3 men left the inn and disappeared into the darkness. When the authorities heard the news of the robberies, and Jean came forward and told about John Worthington and his gang, a manhunt for Worthington immediately went underway. Their advertiser newspaper printed an advert offering a reward of 20 guineas for any information leading to the arrest of the wanted man. Worthington was picked up in Glasgow and then taken to Ayr. He was charged with highway robbery at the High Court in Edinburgh on the 17th of January 1815. Found guilty, John Worthington was condemned to be hanged at the Symington Toll Bar, about halfway between Kilmarnock and Ayr, near the spot where the robberies had been committed. On the afternoon of the 16th of February, John Worthington was put on a mail coach in Edinburgh and taken to Glasgow with a military escort. The Caledonian Mercury newspaper stated Worthington was deeply affected by the situation, but was calm and collected. In Glasgow, he received a visit from his daughter, who was around 17 years old. He advised her against keeping bad company. The prisoner, after receiving religious comfort, then slept for 3 hours. The next day, the 17th, the condemned man was transferred to Kilmarnock, where he was placed on a cart. This cart journeyed to the place of execution, here at Symington. This is where the old toll house stood, where charges for using the road were paid. The Sheriff of Ayr and other officials arrived in coaches. Worthington was dressed neatly in black clothes and wore a great coat. He took off his hat and asked for it to be given to his son, who was around 12 years old. A large crowd had gathered to watch the highway robber hang. As the crowd waited for the convict to arrive, the hangman, Tam Young, from Glasgow, practised on the scaffold, pulling the lever or trigger that would open the trapdoors over and over again. This was his first job. When the lever was pulled, the crowd would cheer. This seemed to affect the nerves of the executioner. It was his first execution, and it was stated that when John Worthington turned up, the hangman looked more nervous than the man condemned to die. A bystander shouted loudly, "Poor boy!" Worthington looked at the man and said, "I am not poor now." On the scaffold, the doomed man was offered a drink of wine or spirits, which he refused. But he did ask for a drink of water. This was given to him, and he drank it down greedily. The noose was then placed around the prisoner's neck, and a cap placed over the head. John Worthington then gave the signal. The lever was pulled, and he fell to his end. The body was left for an hour before being cut down, put in a cart, and taken to be buried in Kilmarnock. The execution of Worthington would have probably taken place. It was right opposite the toll house, so it would probably be in the South Lane on the present dual carriageway, or perhaps in the field just beyond that. But at the time it was said it was a field directly opposite the old toll bar. It was stated that John Worthington was killed for highway robbery, but whether he was a highwayman of lore or adamant fame, with the face mask, the horse, the pistols that would yell out "stand and deliver," or what's commonly known as a footpad, and that is a robber on foot. There's been no mention of him and his gang having horses, but I'm not sure. If you go to the village of Moncton, you must go and visit St Cuthbert's Church. It's an ancient place, once part of Paisley Abbey, and it was here in 1296 William Wallace fell into a trance. While unconscious or semi-conscious, he was approached by St Andrew, who asked him to save the country from the English. The church, there's a gate, a lock gate, you can't get into it. We can see it from the roadside, and there is a sign there with a phone number to phone if you want access, probably if you've got relatives buried in the cemetery. If you've enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe. You might like to take one of our dark history tours, ghost tours, or paranormal investigations that are held in Perthshire, Glasgow and Stirling. If so, please visit our website, which is www.historyandhorrortours.com. Thank you.